Anyone that doesn't know, Guild Wars 2 just had one of its first big patches after its second expansion, Path of Fire. This patch introduced to the microtransaction shop for the game mount skins, 30 new mount skins in fact. They're not the first mount skins to have come in, a few arrived a couple of weeks ago as well during Halloween, but with these 30 mount skins, we see the introduction of a new system, it seems, that involves their acquisition. This is a system that has a lot of RNG on it. I'll describe that in a second. The big thing to take away though, if you've been out of the loop, is the Guild Wars 2 community and even other areas of the internet that usually don't care about Guild Wars whatsoever have exploded in outrage, and it's kind of become a really big deal in terms of bad press for the game, negative feelings for the player base, threats to quit, uninstall, all of that normal good stuff. So today I want to talk about that stuff. The footage in the background is completely irrelevant aside from the fact it's a bit of Path of Fire footage, and it will show off the mounts, the skins that are available, and a bit of mount gameplay. So this is, as you can tell from the timestamp, if you haven't looked already, it's a long video. And it's not just a long video because it's a bit of a joke that I make long videos and I have to play into that. It's a long video because I think topics like this are extremely complicated, and I think they're extremely important too. I really care about this game, so the way we talk about this is important. And that means we have to actually look at a lot of facts and go through a lot of things. I know a lot of you are going to be looking at this hoping for a TLDW, but please do refrain from giving TLDWs if you can help it. I actually kind of like that this will be a long discussion because it should mean anyone just charging around on a hate-filled bandwagon without the capacity to really think about stuff is just gonna leave at the door. They'll consider this droning and rambling, and we can be free of them and get to our nerdy, boring stuff. So, I do have another disclaimer about this video, and it's a really important one I know a lot of you guys aren't gonna like, but this is not gonna be a very charged production. This is not going to be me slamming my fists down. This is not going to be me telling ArenaNet off. This is not going to be anything of the sort. I know a lot of people are looking out for that. They want me to slam my fist down. They want me to slam my fist down because they think me throwing my hat into this ring will give their arguments more substance. They want me to slam my fist down because they think it might make ArenaNet listen to them. They want me to slam my fist down because it's nice having people agreeing in strong terms with us. But the truth is, I don't have any desire to join the circle jerk on this topic. I'd rather stay away from the chorus, though admittedly me making this video kind of puts me in that category. Now, it's not because I don't think this topic's important, and it's not because I don't fundamentally agree with what everyone wants, because I do agree, and I do understand people's viewpoints. But it's because I feel a lot of what needed to be said was already said within the first hour of this thing, and the rest has just been said because it feels good fighting for a cause. It's because, honestly, I question how much our discussion of this is really worth, and I'll talk on that more in a moment. But more importantly than anything else, it's because I've gone through several of these backlashes already on like the multiple year time scale, and a lot of it feels very circular to previous discussions. I genuinely have a knot in my chest making this video because I know people are going to be annoyed that I don't see eye to eye with them, but I have to be real with you and have some sense of integrity of myself. I'm not going to fake being mad just because that's the expectation. So I'm going to go ahead and say it. You want a strong opinion, and here it is. I understand people, but I am not remotely pissed off about mount adoptions. No, really, not a tiny part of me feels any anger towards ArenaNet or NCSoft over this at all. There's maybe a tiny tinge of disappointment in there, but that's it. Now, not being pissed off about this is going to get me called a sellout. Not being pissed off about this is going to get called me a contrarian in all the most pejorative of senses. Not being pissed off is going to lead to accusations of any number of ulterior motives. I've seen multiple suggestions this past 2 days of ArenaNet somehow silencing their partners who stand against them as though we're somehow scared or bullied out of our real thoughts by them. But the simple truth is this. I just don't identify with this level of charged emotion. Neither do I really want to get into the business of exploiting those charged emotions to cash in on crusades, pretending to care more about things than I do, as that's just about the lowest bar of success on YouTube, and you have plenty of people to watch already for that. And additionally, I will also say, by the way, as to the ArenaNet silencing partners things, outside of NDAs, I have never once in 7 years felt bullied out of an opinion for fear of what the devs might think think of me. I've always been perfectly honest, and that's what I'll do today here too. So top level, here's how I feel, like it or lump it. What happened on this patch sucks, but the response is massively out of proportion. So let's take it to the top and fill everyone in on exactly what happened here. On the gem store with this balance patch and several changes to Path of Fire rewards and meta-based stuff, we got two new things. First was the Jackal skin, which costs 2,000 gems, an extremely expensive mount skin. It's called the Reforged Warhorn. It looks like the Balthazar outfit set from a while ago. There's also Balthazar weapons that look a bit like this. It's a very different style to all the other mounts, and it's an example of a mount that didn't just change the skin, but it changed the model as well. So this is kind of like a legendary skin, if you will, like you might find in a game like League, all right? So it's very expensive, and it's supposed to be of a higher quality and had a lot more effort put into it. They're selling it for a whopping 2,000 gems. Also, there's another system, and this is the thing that got people backed up more than anything else. They're called mount adoption contracts. So for 400 gems, you can buy one of these items, and what it will do is unlock a mount skin for you. There are 30 available. So they added 30 all with this one patch, which makes it, actually, in terms of assets, one of the biggest gem store patches I think we've ever seen. Some of these skins are like fiery versions of the mounts. Some of them have model tweaks, a bit like the Reforged Jackal. Some of them have slight texture and pattern changes. They have more dye channels and all of that. Some of them look really good. Some of them don't look so good, but there are 30 of them. 30 at a cost of 400 gems each is a total, to get all of them, of 12,000 gems, putting that into one of the most expensive things in the gem store we've had. The other really important thing to note about mount adoption contracts is that it's RNG when you buy one. You don't actually know which of the 30 skins you're going to get until you double click it and it unlocks. There is a system that prevents you getting duplicates. So it's not pure RNG where I could spend 400 gems, get a skin that I didn't want, and then spend another 400 gems and get the same one again. There are no duplicates, and so if you buy 30 of them, you're guaranteed all of them. But the truth is, there is no guaranteed way of knowing what you're going to get for your money. And if you've just listened to me there, you should understand that what I just said sucks. It is a bad system, and people have every right to be upset about it. If you're not quite on board on why this is kind of lame, I'll go through the list for you. First of all, yes, we've got RNG, right? Let's face it, RNG gets a bad rap in gaming in general, let alone before you attach it to something like the gem store and microtransactions. And it's got a bad rap for well-documented and justified reasons. I'm on board with the dislike for RNG. Guild Wars as a franchise as well, I will say, in the early days, was a franchise proud to minimize RNG in response to the kind of ridiculous stuff you find elsewhere in the genre. So you would hope that they wouldn't engage in this kind of thing. Not on this kind of scale, not today, and not 2 years down the line or beyond, okay? As devil's advocate, I would note that RNG isn't pure evil. There is some fun in RNG. I've played many RPGs that I've enjoyed elements of RNG in them, and I'm not talking purely about it's good for toxic gambling, psychology, and manipulative related reasons. If I imagine this, for example, as a non-gem store system, but rather just a general part of Path of Fire, like feeding your Springer a treat and all these other systems that went in with the mounts. If I think of it as just a regular part of the game that had been here at launch and wasn't associated with gems or whatever, let's say it was like a breeding mechanic, right, with RNG on what would come out of your Springer's egg, and maybe you'd get one of the 30 skins. I actually think that could be really fun. I can imagine the RNG being something enjoyable there and feeling some sentimental attachment to the first skin I get and wanting to rep that more than the other ones. And provided that system doesn't have duplicates, which the gem store version doesn't, I think it could be good. So RNG is not innately bad. But why this RNG importantly sucks is because we're rolling the dice attached to a very difficult to acquire currency, gems. Now, if you've invested a lot on something, rolled the dice, and landed on snake eyes, you're gonna feel pretty sad. That's the core of this, right? That's why this RNG sucks. It doesn't actually matter if it's on the gem store or not. If I imagine an in-game version of this, but it has a large cost as well, well, people won't like that. That's like precursor rolling, and that was proven to be largely disliked. So notice, by the way, how I said a difficult to acquire currency there. I didn't say this RNG is bad because we're rolling the dice on real world money. No, I mean, that is bad for its own ethical reasons, and we'll discuss those in a second. But neither did I say this RNG is bad because we're rolling the dice on Guild Wars 2 Gold. It's not really about that. Most people are getting stuck on this point. I'm just saying it sucks because we're rolling the dice on difficult to acquire currency. Because it doesn't actually matter if you did this with real world money or with in-game money. It's because for the majority of people, it's RNG on a large investment, and you don't feel like a valued customer player as a result. That's the important bit. As a side note, while we're in this little cul-de-sac, I've seen a lot of discussion over the past 2 days related to this on gold to gems, and whether the existence of gold to gems allows systems like Mount adoption to happen and still be considered consumer-friendly practice. So the argument is this, basically, right? Everybody's backlashing and they're all on a high horse and they have no reason for it. The developers aren't forcing you to spend real-world money, just earn it in-game, so it's going to be perfectly okay. And as I've said before, I do think that argument actually does have some merit. I do think the existence of a gold to gem transfer in Guild Wars 2 does count for something when we're talking about gem store related topics. And I am dismayed at how frequently it is flat out pretended to not exist or pushed aside just because it gets in the way of the angry narrative. Gems to Gold gives you freedom as a consumer. You can't deny that. It has allowed the developers to push the limits of the gem store several times in the past, and it still does here too. It counts for something. Now, the main rebuttal to Gems for Gold also has merit, and this is that Gems to Gold, whether it's officially supported or not, would happen anyway. It would just be happening through third-party sites. All ArenaNet's really done by putting it in their game first party is they made it so that they would earn the proceeds instead of shady websites. And I can understand that. Nobody's arguing that the devs are somehow honorable for having done this. It's about their bottom line. Everything to do with the gem store is. It's probably 100% accurate to say that. But there's a big difference between a small slice of the player base engaging in Gems to Gold by going to third-party websites and having to risk bans and doing things in back rooms versus an officially sanctioned procedure that is perfectly evident to everyone who plays the game. There is a massive difference there, and I don't agree with the people who are pretending that doesn't exist. Another great argument against Gems to Gold that I quite like is reminding people that without someone paying, someone has to buy the gems with real-world cash. Without that, it wouldn't work at all. Because remember, gems are a player-driven economy, and that gets thrown aside far too much. But despite these 2 points, I still stand by what I said at the start, that gold to gems-based arguments are getting a bad rap. And particularly, this is important to me when people are comparing this Guild Wars 2 situation to other AAAs and their shady microtransaction procedures. When we lump Guild Wars 2 in a bucket with other genuinely shady and aggressive and manipulative microtransaction heavy games, we should remember that gold to gems does exist in Guild Wars 2 and often in other titles it does not. Comparatively speaking, with other products out there, Guild Wars 2 has been a very solid product in terms of delivering consumer-friendly microtransaction purchases. And I would make the argument that a lot of the reason for that is based on the existence of gold to gems. I hope I haven't been saying that the wrong way around. So, moving on from the very 2012, frankly, discussions of gold to gems, we're also skirting around discussions of value for money right now. So we're talking about reasons why this would suck, and some people have said it sucks because everything's too expensive. And I think that's a fair argument. I can get behind that, especially when we look at the 2000 gem single mounts. But I do think this is murky water to get into. It's tricky because you'll often have outliers with massive or minimal wealth, either in Guild Wars or out of Guild Wars, claiming that their viewpoint's the correct one. So, for example, you might have someone who plays 10 hours a day every day for 5 years, and he's got tons of money, and he thinks the mounts are cheap, so he goes online and says that, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. Or alternatively, you might have a high-powered executive that chooses Guild Wars 2 as his game, and he's got thousands in the bank, and he doesn't mind busting out the credit card, and he'll say that the mounts are cheap, but he's probably wrong as well. And there's a lot in the middle ground there that makes this murky waters. So I don't want to get too stuck on that. Generally, I would say most people in this backlash don't seem that unhappy with the price. It's only the RNG that they don't like. But there has been questioning of the legendary jackal, as I said. I'm not interested in talking about value for money much, really. You probably already have an opinion on whether they're too pricey or not. Generally speaking, I don't think you should be watching a YouTube video from someone else who has a different financial situation to you and different subject opinions on the cosmetics of these things to dictate your opinion on whether it's too expensive or not. I've seen a defense of ArenaNet by pointing out that it's basically just a legendary weapon's worth of gold for all 30 of the skins, and that mounts are much bigger and more visually evident than a single weapon, so clearly this is great value for money, and what's everyone talking about? But I don't know how much I buy into that, because, as I said, a legendary weapon from a long-established player is of a very different value than to someone who just arrived with Path of Fire. These arguments only get you so far. To return to the top of this discussion, let's just be clear. There's RNG on these things. This is the anti-consumer practice. RNG could have been fun if this was cheaper, but they're not, and I don't blame anyone who is miffed about that fact. If you want to be able to spend a finite amount of gems on a finite skin, I don't think there should be anything wrong with that, and the devs muscling you out of that opportunity is predatory. So that's really the big one, RNG. There are some other smaller reasons, though, that I've seen thrown around as to why people don't like this decision, and I do think that they're worth going over. First is kind of a moral or an ethical question of the devs preying on gamblers and people with addictive personalities and people who suffer in those kinds of areas. So basically, we all know what we mean here, that there are vulnerable people out there who can be easily manipulated into this stuff, and it's very damaging for their lives, and Guild Wars 2 shouldn't be doing it. The counterpoint, I guess, to this argument, which sounds reasonable on a surface level, is that you can't get duplicates. So there's only so much someone can gamble on these skins until they've spent the maximum amount of money and they're done, right? There is an end point, which is fair. But at that point, you might have spent 120 bucks and taken that from the poor sod, and maybe we should be looking out for these people. It's also true that if you tell, like, a gambler or someone who might suffer from this that you don't get duplicates, that essentially just translates into escalating odds of getting what they want. So to put this in a real situation, if I want one of these specific mounts, I spend 400 gems and I don't get it. But last time I only had a 1 in 30 chance of getting it. Now I have a 1 in 29 chance. So I try again. Now it's only 1 in 28. I try again and again and again, and my odds are increasing, thus encouraging me to keep going and spend far more than I otherwise would have. Because at the point where I would want to stop, now the odds look a lot more lucrative. It's like when someone's stuck at a slot machine and they think it's going to pay out any second now because they've already spent so long there, right? So I see a lot of people talking about this, perhaps even feigning some fear for all those potentially vulnerable people out there, maybe even with a heart-touching anecdote for us to rally around, and that's fine, I guess. Personally, I think it's a pretty tacky argument to go into, and it very much puts me in the mind of Maud Flanders wildly waving around for people to please think of the children. I don't deny it's a serious issue, but I also don't believe in arguing for phantoms, and so this is a minor point on my list. Another reason why this kind of sucks is visual effects and the visual integrity and space of the game. This one I actually care about quite a lot, funnily. So it's essentially visual effects bloat, something that Guild Wars 2 has struggled with for a long time. Some of these skins are pretty garish, all right? Now, you might like the giant fiery looking mount when it's alone on a preview there and you imagine you're the only person to have it, but now imagine there's a Zerg of 20 to 30 people all riding the same one. It can drag your frame rate down and it can just make the place look like a cluster, which sucks. In fact, there were some pre-Path of Fire discussions on Reddit, I remember very clearly, where people were talking about visual integrity, and we were looking at Heart of Thorns. Heart of Thorns introduced gliding, and many glider skins were sold, none of them under this RNG heavy system, admittedly. But they sold lots of gliders, and some of the gliders looked ridiculous and really broke the styling of the game, especially like Super Adventure Box gliders. A lot of people took issue with. And so the question is, will they do it with mounts as well? And immediately some people have been ticked off by this. They want Tyria to look a certain way, and mounts, the way that they look is extremely important. Mounts don't go away when you're standing still like a glider would. They're always there. And so if they look ridiculous, then the game on a whole can look kind of ridiculous. The specific Reddit thread I recall, people were talking about, what was it, Rift maybe? Or some Korean MMO, I think, where essentially they had tons of mounts that were taxi cabs people were riding around in a fantasy RPG, and it just looked awful. So my opinions on this are, yes, I'm worried about that. However, I will counter by saying I feel like we passed that point a long time ago. People have been right to point out that at the launch of Guild Wars 2, there was like a t-shirt and a baseball hat that you could wear. These skins aren't as ridiculous as taxi cab mounts, but the lines have been pushed consistently, and if you cared about the visual integrity of Guild Wars 2, I don't think that the moment you start complaining about it, particularly is here with mounts, because it kind of got broken a long time ago. Though I will admit that this has kind of pushed the line. There's actually a lot to talk about here, from introducing an option to disable other people's mount skins to the way that rewards work in the game, but I'll leave it there because I think that all that discussion is tangential at best, and we just recently went over it all when we were talking about the cut spider mount and why they didn't add it because they didn't want to trigger people's arachnophobia. Next reason that people don't like this, and here's a big one for me, and that's a lack of in-game attainable ways of getting these. So this is a discussion that happens every single time for the past 5 years an update has come to the gem store, and that's a lot of updates. People do not like the fact that if you get something on the gem store, it's a cool asset, it's a cool weapon, it's a cool outfit, it's a cool whatever, you could be winning that, earning that as a reward for doing something difficult or interesting or out of the ordinary in the game. But instead of it being a reward in the game, we just get it out of the UI. We just magically get it mailed to us, and it's nothing more than entering your credit card details or transferring some gold. It's a boring way to get stuff. It's a missed opportunity. Every time it's happened, but hey, it earns ArenaNet profit. So this is even more particularly stinging now, though, with the 30 skins, because if you think about it, they've added 30 of them. It would have been quite easy to just take a couple and make them in-game earnable. That's all they'd have to do, and people would be satisfied. You know, if they made 30 and they give us just 5 of them, 1 for each, I think that's perfectly reasonable, and that would have done a lot to placate the community, but they didn't do that. Now, I do have my suspicions that rather than this being about conniving money grubbing and stuff, it could be something to do with the company workflow. People who have been in the community for a long time will remember when one of the prominent raid releases came out with Heart of Thorns, the previous expansion, we had basically raid rewards being dropped in the gem store, and people backlashed about it, and the devs responded by saying, yeah, it's because it was a different team and we just kind of didn't think about it. So I wonder if a similar thing happened here, that the 30 mount skins were all handled by one cell of people in one room, and there wasn't much opportunity to hand them off to someone else to put it in some meaningful content. But whether that's really a good justification for us on the consumer end, I don't know. It just might be a bit of an explanation. On a defense of ArenaNet's end for this bit, I will say I'm not quite sure why people got the idea that mount skins would be released in-game. It would be nice, it would be a perk, it's kind of an afterthought to me, but they set up a precedent with gliding skins, and to me it's always been very clear that you don't earn that stuff in-game. It's basically just gem store. I don't think there was a single glider skin, was there, that we could actually earn in-game? Maybe there was one, but that would be like it. And I assumed that the mount skins would be exactly the same. So I don't think it's fair. While this sucks, I don't think it's fair to say that this was a sudden cop-out or a defiance of expectations, because I think they'd pretty clearly shown that that wasn't going to be much of a thing. Something we suck, but it's not news exactly. A couple of other smaller reasons why people don't like this. First, the quality of the skins. They're really inconsistent. You know, some skins have got amazing model differences and look really gorgeous and beautiful and have different visual effects. Some of them look really bland and plain, and they're not that interesting. I actually think this is kind of inherent to the fact they made this an RNG thing, right? Like, not everything can look as good as everything else. When you've added 30 items, you're going to have an opinion about one looking better than the other. And maybe that can be quite a drastic difference. I believe also what they might have been trying to do is add 30 skins and go a broad range, so they can have the crazy weird fiery ones for the people that like that, but then they can also have some muted ones with just some slight pattern differences for people that like more subtle and subdued effects. And so as a result, it's given this impression that they didn't put much effort into some, but they put a lot of effort into others, and I don't think that that's particularly fair. I think we're all going to have subjective varying opinions on some looking better than others, and it's just part and parcel of the RNG issue, this one, really. Also, another problem, and I agree with this one to an extent, especially for casual players, is the idea that, let's say you unlock a skin, but it unlocks for a mount you don't use. That's a potential. What if I spend 1,200 gems on 3 of these adoption contracts, and I get 3 skimmer mounts? And I don't really like the skimmer or use the skimmer. Now, as it happens, I actually do quite like the skimmer, but let's say I don't like the skimmer and, I don't have much reason for it. And practically speaking, it is one of those mounts that you don't get on so much. Well, you kind of got less value for your money then, didn't you? Than, say, someone who got jackal skins or a raptor if they prefer to use those. I think that's totally valid, and especially when we then realize the griffin. The griffin is a hidden mount at the end of the game behind a 250 gold paywall, the personal story that you have to complete the entire thing, and a bunch of collections. That's quite a lot to go through, and for very casual players, they might not have the Griffin. Now let's imagine I've just bought a bunch of contracts and I get the Griffin, multiple Griffin skins that I can't use. I don't deny that would be pretty gross. When they released the Halloween skins, they did them in a package. That meant, yes, you got the Griffin, but at least you had all the others at the same time. And I think that's a worthwhile problem with the system. Very legitimate one. And lastly, this is a final point of why people don't like this is kind of small. But I think it's got some merit. It's sort of sleazy. I just talked in this video about ArenaNet having had a good reputation for not dicking people over with their gem store for all these years throughout the game, and now it looks like they're turning over a new leaf and they're doing something that's a little bit less anti-consumer. And that's not what we want to see from ArenaNet. We don't want to see that the game we play is becoming exploitative in its microtransaction practices, and that's basically what's happening here. Was the complete obliteration of any credit they had built at all over 5 years justifiable in its scale as a response? I think not. But it is kind of lame that unfortunately they went for this instead of just letting us buy skins outright and forcing RNG on us. So there you go, that's the reasons why people don't like it. I think, honestly, a lot of you will be listening to me on the fringes of the community who haven't been watching the absolute scale of this and think, well, there you go, that's it, that's the whole video. And it's not even a very interesting video because it doesn't sound that major. But you guys have to understand, this has been quite explosive. I haven't seen a controversy or a backlash like this since the don't pre-purchase Heart of Thorns, or perhaps when legendary weapons were announced to be going on hiatus, one I participated in very much myself. And ended up getting egg on my face over. This is pretty big, I would say. Even Ascended Gear coming into the game with Fractals of the Mist scale. So how did we get to this point of it becoming so important to people? I do want to take a second to analyze that. And it's not that I'm throwing judgment on anyone or suggesting that their points are less valid based on the things I'm about to say, but I do think it's important to set the stage. At the start of the video, I said I agreed with the points people are making, which I do, but not the scale of the hysteria. So how do we explain the scale of this? Now, obviously, anyone embroiled in this backlash is just going to say, well, WP, it's obvious. We're backlashing because of the points you just said. We don't need any more reason. But I do think there is some more going on. Because if you take a second to read any of the threads and see the discussion, you'll see a ton of other dissatisfaction with the game filtered in there too. You don't get countless people openly expressing excitement that the game is being killed and needs to fall on its sword and other such stuff, meeting mass applause just because of mount adoption licenses. So first to see, I think, is the fact we're in a slump right after an expansion. And it's not been a very long slump. It's just over a month. But we've had weeks of excitement leading up to this brand new thing that was supposed to be a big paradigm shift and, Guild Wars 2's heyday and so forth. Then we have the expansion itself and we fly through the content, and now we're wondering what to do. And people are always very keenly watching those next few patches after a big release that we've been anticipating. Now, the hype months rolling into Path of Fire were a lot shorter, so perhaps it's not quite as stinging as in previous releases, but these are sensitive moments. People are finished with the expansion and they're wondering if they want to stick around. They're wondering why they feel dissatisfied, and mostly it's because there's nothing in-game meaningful for them to occupy them anymore. Many people have even considered the balance patch that this gem store update came with to have been late, and many people have disregarded the Halloween update altogether because they've played it before. So if ArenaNet flop on a patch like this, they flop big, or just any game developer at this point in their product's life cycle, I would say. I'd also say Path of Fire having a lack of content on release did a lot too. Specifically, when I say that, I mean fractals and raiding. And I say specifically raiding and fractals because they obviously have not been a part of Path of Fire yet, but also because I am of the belief regular POF, the open world stuff and the story, I believe it does have a ton of content, even if we might all be done with it right now. But that's because Path of Fire lacks that Heart of Thorn style meta repetitiveness and meaningful rewards that keep us around in there for longer. Because of that, because the content was packaged in the way that it was with its achievements and so forth, Path of Fire you can run through very quickly. But I do think there was a lot of content except for the fractals and the raids. Talking about this, of course, leads us in a totally different direction of discussion. The idea that people are just getting what they asked for with Path of Fire because they complained so much with the Heart of Thorns format, because people saw it as grind back then. Even they considered it as grind after Heart of Thorns 2.0. And now people are complaining at the reverse, which of course leads to the discussion of ArenaNet should just find a balance somewhere in the middle. But whatever the case, the fact is that people right now, and right as this patch released, have been feeling unsatisfied. And that makes for fertile ground for a big controversy, I'd say. I'll leave it up to you guys, for what it's worth, to imagine if Path of Fire had done the Heart of Thorns format, where it has lots of repeatable rewards and perceivable grind, but it keeps people meaningfully busy. Imagine a world where this controversy lands now. Would things have been better or worse when the priority accusation and feelings of disgruntlement isn't at a lack of things to do, but because we think the game is grindy instead? I'll note that this is also extremely similar timing to the large controversy after Vanilla, with Ascended Gear being added, timing-wise. It's very similar. It's very similar to the don't pre-purchase Heart of Thorns outrage during the post-Living World Season 2 drought. It's very similar to the legendary weapon pull-out messaging after Heart of Thorns during another drought. So I'm not saying that the specifics of any of these discussions had no merit, and that it's just because people are bored and they want to whinge after they finish playing a big product, but I do think that there's a pattern here for a reason. Also, perhaps most importantly of all, for this big backlash, you have to look at broader gaming. Now, I'm not going to dive into a social analysis of the rise of outrage culture amongst millennials and all that and whatnot, but for video gaming specifically, it's definitely true that people easily confuse criticism for intellectualism, and they can feel a lot of pride in attacking something mob style because it's so-called for a good cause. Again, this isn't to say I think people are wrong on the finer points of this backlash, but to try and understand how things have emotionally spiraled far beyond a point that I can actually relate to. Specifically important, though, is the propagation of loot boxes across AAA gaming, and the fear of the slippery slope into the really scummy practices like we see all over mobile gaming in particular. NCSoft revenues from which, by the way, utterly dwarf all of PC gaming right now. It is one of the biggest hot buttons in gaming discussion these days, with people building entire careers off of their derision of it. Guild Wars 2 has always hid inside of that maelstrom, and so obviously when it grows a bit, maybe with Path of Fire, and then ArenaNet do something like this to shake it around, they're asking for trouble. And I do think at this point it's gotten large enough that there's a lot of outside brigading going on. It reminds me a lot of when the price of the Oculus Rift was announced and what happened to that core community back then. So not all of these comments I take particularly seriously or of particular merit, but I digress. One final thing I think, for what it's worth, that may have caused the spark here is another thing they did on the Gem Store. It's the inclusion of the Mount Adoption License 30 pack. So I've not talked about this, but essentially it's another item you can buy on the Gem Store that gives you everything and allows you to bypass the RNG. But it's at an extreme price. It costs 9,600 gems. Now that 9,600 gems is a discount on if you bought them all separately, which comes to 12,000 gems, right? And a discount sounds like a good thing. And the option to bypass RNG like this might even be considered consumer friendly from the devs. But I think that the ArenaNet putting this in did more harm than good. Because I'll bet that a lot of people in the earliest moments, before there was anything notable about this at all, they didn't really acknowledge this mount system as anything too weird. It's just a 400 gem thing on the store, right? But that big bundle being there, that big bundle at such a high price makes it obvious what's going on. It makes it obvious that you're going to have to pay a premium to avoid the RNG. And what's more, further, it makes you think of this entire adoption system as being something you need right here, right now, instead of a long-term progression that you'll just get every now and then, which is what I'm pretty sure the devs were going for, and I'll talk about more in a moment. So I think that did a lot of damage, even if the intent was to give people an RNG-less option. To make things worse, they made this 30-pack only available for 7 days. So people see it, they see the high price, it starts to dawn on them what's going on, and then they realize they only have a few days to make a decision on it as well, and it just comes across as exploitative. I'll go on the record and say that I'm fairly confident had ArenaNet not released this pass and instead just rolled out the mounts at a rate of a couple a day for, you know, a month or so, but the system was otherwise exactly the same, they just released it more slowly, it was exactly as anti-consumer as you believe it to be, I'm going to go on the record and say that if they'd done it that way, there'd be no backlash at all. Beyond the usual rumblings of wanting this stuff in-game earnable and visual effects bloat and so on. I really do believe in that. It's very similar to when they were selling storage collection expansions. If they had released all of those all at once and given you a big bundle price that really showed you how much you'd have to spend to max that stuff out, I think people would have been more disgusted by it than they were in the end. Obviously, none of this touches on the RNG aspect, which is obviously a lot worse, but I really do believe that. Secondary to this point, I'm also a bit disappointed in how few people discuss this system as a piecemeal thing. So many people who are angry right now are basing their arguments off of the default worst case scenario and pretending that that is what will always happen. They're saying you need all 29 other mounts before you get the one you really want. You need to buy everything all in one go. You can't get these gradually. I know it sounds like you might have more of a point when you do this, and talking about the extreme does have some use, obviously, but it's not the reality of this system. Most people in this discussion are discrediting themselves by taking the implementation of the system to unrealistic extremes to justify their anger and make the devs look more predatory than they actually are. So, that's why I think there's a huge backlash. Those are the finer points and where I agree with what's actually going on. I want to talk a little bit about ArenaNet's side now and why perhaps they did this, because I think there's some interesting stuff to look at here. Now, this is largely speculative. Obviously, I have no real idea. I can only speculate based on what I've found out from covering the game for X number of years. So let's look at the success of the game right now, and let's see how you'd feel if you were ArenaNet, all right? So, you have one product on the go. You as a company do one thing. It's called Guild Wars 2, it's an MMO, and it's aging. Not only is it aging, but rather than steadily growing, your game, your one product, has actually been on a general downward trend, revenue-wise, since its launch. Now, it is a very slow downward trend, but it's true. Guild Wars 2 is on a slow downward trend. And you've had some major population spikes, like at launch you had an enormous one, you have one at Heart of Thorns, you have one at various milestones, but nonetheless, you are trending downwards. Your first big idea on how to innovate, on how you develop a live game, Living World Season 1, that didn't work out at all. Your second big idea to expand the game and maybe reverse that downward trend into China didn't work particularly well. Your first expansion, Heart of Thorns, did a lot for the game's vision, for its community, for expectations of where it's going, but as Season 3 progressed, you ultimately still failed to reverse that steady downward trend, and the game isn't in a position of general growth after X number of years of investment into it. Now we hit today. You've just released your second expansion. Here we are. Now, call me a fool, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that ArenaNet are looking at Guild Wars 2, they're looking at their company long term, and they're wondering if this MMO is going to remain the be-all and end-all for them. I'm going to guess that there are a lot of passionate devs and people there who care about this franchise, who care about this world, who care about this community, even when it attempts to devour itself in moments like now. I'm going to guess that that's true, but I'm also going to guess that there are some jitters. And I'm going to go on a limb, and I'm going to say that if Path of Fire doesn't turn that trend upwards, if Path of Fire doesn't earn big, if we don't see it swap, then they're probably going to have to start looking at pursuing other ventures, things that are profitable long term. I've noticed that some community members have been analysing NCSoft quarterly reports and, comparing charts and things, and that's all well and good, but I don't think we have to go that far, guys. It's very simple. If Guild Wars 2 doesn't start trending upwards, at some point, ArenaNet have to look at making or doing something new, whether they love this franchise or not. Else, where's the joy in all of this? No one in the game wants to feel like they're a part of a shrinking community. No developer wants to feel like their passions and talents are going into a product where it's no more than the equivalent of bailing water out of a very slowly sinking ship. No employee wants to feel like they're in a company whose ultimate fate is unprofitability. No one wants to run that company. A while back, when I started my Get Path of Fire competition, an initiative to grow the game scene, I described in a comment on Reddit as Path of Fire as a potential last gasp. And people questioned that as hyperbolic and potentially out of place. But I really meant it. I've been covering the game for 7 years, playing it for 11. Long term, I think Path of Fire could be a pivot and a crucial release for the franchise. I think anyone who loves Guild Wars and wants to see it succeed long term and stay as the mainstay, then they want to see Path of Fire earning in ways that Heart of Thorns and the previous Living World seasons haven't. So Path of Fire releases. Now, Path of Fire was priced cheaper than Heart of Thorns was. The aim here is obviously to address the value for money criticisms that came with Heart of Thorns. It's cheaper, but obviously the devs are hoping that through word of mouth and the better value for money will cause them to shift more copies and they'll ultimately earn more. Now, I'm a little hazy on this. I've seen some comments about this, but I believe in the end, either they earned the same on those boxes or maybe even lower, or there's no official stats and it's just something people are throwing around out there. So let's assume any of those situations to be true, right? Now what? You're ArenaNet. Where do you look to? You look to the gem store. And specifically, you look to your mounts. You look to your community who have been asking for mount skins, assuming you'll do mount skins despite your silence on it, and you decide to go for it. You prototype something for Halloween, it's reasonably successful. People say that they don't like the bundle, but aside from that, it does okay. And so you prepare for the big one. Taking a second just to talk about the community and community expectations, Dalen Dwin has a very funny YouTube video on this. I'll put in the link in the descriptions, pointing out the hundreds, if not thousands of comments before this backlash from the Guild Wars 2 community, where we were all screaming, "Take my money," and playing around with multiple thousand gem expensive mounts, explaining that people are happy to spend, however much it takes to get various skins. I do think it's important to recognize how much joking around there was of that in the community before this patch came out. It's funny because I feel my own mindset was fully set and ready for price gouging, for kind of, expensive and difficult practices and high costs on these skins. I was ready for that. I was ready for people to grumble about it, but I presumed that that was what was going to happen. Almost everyone I knew understood this as the likely scenario because mount skins are well understood cash cows. I must have misread the community big time, because it seems the line between people openly joking about that and gushing about taking my money and those who were actually prepared to face the reality was a lot of a thicker line than I realized, and it's taken people unawares in a way that I certainly didn't anticipate. But see, as ArenaNet, before this patch, you're seeing all this enthusiasm. You probably feel like you can push the line a little bit because people are so expectant of it, or seemingly so. So you try some new stuff. Let's look back at what they did this patch. One of the things was adding a 30 mount package that costs 9,000 gems. Why might the devs have done that? Well, possibly because if they can get people to buy that, they can get people acclimated and used to spending large amounts of money on the gem store. And once consumers are used to spending large amounts of money, they're more likely to do it again. So they'll put that in there as a bit of a test. And more importantly, I think what the devs were doing here was they were trying to create an infrastructure for releasing future mount skins that would be largely profitable on the long term. I mentioned this earlier, but I really think it's true that most of us in the community are thinking of, we're supposed to get all 30 mounts very quickly. I think that this is just what ArenaNet wanted to do for Path of Fire and beyond, continuously adding more mounts into this and just having that mount adoption thing always available for an RNG shot at getting a random mount. I think that that's genuinely what they were going for, and they wanted it to be a long-term system because it's not about giving a big spike of profit right as Path of Fire comes out, but it's about reversing that downward trend that we talked about before, making the game as sustainable as possible. And so what I think we saw here was the devs decided to put that infrastructure in, and then separately thought, okay, well, let's go in it explosive at the start. Let's add as many skins as possible right at the beginning. And they landed on 30. But I think that the fact they landed on so many right at the start made it apparent just how bad this RNG is and kind of ended up shooting themselves in the foot. I will say that I think if they'd released this infrastructure but just did 5 mounts this release and a lower price on the complete package, and then 5 mounts came next week, and then 5 mounts and 5 mounts, eventually we'd be up to 30, we'd be up to 40, 50, 60. The RNG would get to ludicrous levels, but the frog would have been slowly boiled and the backlash wouldn't have come, despite the fact that the practice ultimately would have been exactly the same. So that's where we are. I think that on ArenaNet's end is probably what was going on. So next I want to talk a bit about my impressions with all of this. I opened the video by saying I think that this backlash is overblown. And I really stand by that. Now, again, I know people are going to suggest that I have ulterior motives here. It's because I have to protect ArenaNet somehow, or I'm being paid under the table, or whatever other ridiculous nonsense I often hear. So let's try and clear that up. First, and this is a big reason, I will note my own lack of confidence in the worth of any kind of outrage like this and any form of kicking up a fuss like this. Basically, I don't know whether it's worth it. I'm kind of convinced it's a big waste of time. Now, this is sort of separate as to why I don't feel angry about the adoption licenses themselves, but we'll get to those in a second. So obviously, what's going on the internet, right? The idea here is people get angry, you type angry comments, you perhaps exaggerate the reality a little bit, you rely on argumentum ad populum, and if you get enough other people saying it along with you, you can provoke a response from ArenaNet and you can change this dodgy thing. You can force them to get rid of the RNG by being super pissed off. And I get that perspective. I get why people want to be a champion of that cause. Interestingly as well, the backlash did accomplish that. They managed to get a response from ArenaNet on the official forums where the devs are asking for feedback. Now, you might say that the decision to do that and to merge all of the threads into one big one was just damage control, but I think it was genuinely good for them to have acknowledged it that quickly what was happening. I also have some confidence, genuine confidence, given the scale of this backlash, that we'll see some difference. However meaningful or platitudinal it will be, I don't know. Whatever cost that will have to this franchise's reputation or ArenaNet as a company, I also have no idea, but maybe that's not for our place to discuss or care about as consumers. But generally speaking, I'm not actually sure how effective this kind of outrage manipulation is on matters of a company's profits, bottom lines, and revenue streams, and it puts me off getting involved. You might recall actually that this is not the first time the developers have suggested they might make a change for Black Line stuff. It happened for the Black Line chests, I think it was, and an RNG related topic a while ago, about a year ago, but nothing actually came of it. Because the truth is, I wonder, and this is not a pleasant thing to postulate, as much as we want to be listened to about the gem store, as much as our angry comments we want to be listened to, or over the price of an expansion or whatever else, as much as we want some ammunition to force the devs to listen to us on matters of money, do we really have that ammunition? The answer for most Reddit and forum comments is to resort to anecdotes and threats. Okay, so you get stuff like this. Number one, saying, you screwed up ArenaNet and you should listen to me because guess what? I'm not going to buy any of these mount adoption licenses on the gem store. Or number two, people saying, I won't buy anything on the gem store. Listen to me now, I'm not going to buy anything. Or number three, people will say, I'm not going to buy anything. And also, by the way, I'm a whale. I've been spending loads of money. It's really important you listen to me. I'm putting the credit card away. I've been playing since launch, but this is too far, ArenaNet. And you need to listen to me because I'm a whale and I'm stepping away from the plate. Number four, people threatening to not get the next expansion. Number five, people saying that their leverage is that they're not going to recommend the game to anyone anymore. It's so funny, Mo, you ask people for word of mouth advertising and I'm going to take that away from you unless you listen to me. Or number six, the classic, I don't like this so I'm going to uninstall the game and you should listen to me to stop me from uninstalling the game. And so on, right? Whatever people latch onto as their threat, this is what people do. Basically, the idea is this, to fight fire with fire. We appreciate that the developers or publishers are doing this scummy thing to earn money, so we take to online forums and turn it back on them. And we suggest to them that they'd actually be earning more money by being consumer friendly, because otherwise I'll quit or I'll stop spending. And the inference is that because I'm typing this online, there's lots of other people like me who feel the same way, and this is affecting your profits negatively, and I can do that. So most comments on this, even the comments that are really well reasoned and they're bringing up great points and they're not seething with vitriol, most comments on this have that underlying implication. But is that really true? Do we really have that ammo? I question that. Does your anecdote posted to the internet, even amidst an apparent wave of support, does that actually change the statistics? I don't know. I go in game today and I see enormous numbers of players unflinchingly riding on the new mount skins. I see them instantly buying into outfits when that concept was released and people took issue with it. I saw people instantly buying Watchwork sprocket pickaxes or any other issue I've ever had with the gem store. I see multi-million-dollar industries popping up utilizing loot boxes and RNG gambles with real-world money. Someone is buying those and it's profitable. And so when I look at this backlash and the fact it's mostly full of comments like this, these sorts of comments are tiring to me because I'm cynical that they count for anything. Call me a defeatist if you like, but I believe there are people out there with years of experience who are experts on generating profits and devising revenue streams who probably understand more about their stats and what's effective on the gem store than the people at home who are suggesting that no, they have the better money-making idea instead. So I don't know if you can fight fire with fire. And if you can't fight fire with fire, what are you left with? Well, cold comfort indeed. I did say this wasn't a pleasant line of reasoning to think about. And if you can, and that's a big if, but if you can actually force change and say this forum thread that's been created will galvanize some truly great difference beyond simply delaying the inevitable slide into, scummy microtransaction practices, there's a question of what cost it has. Maybe yes, guys, through this backlash we do spur gem store improvements, but what if the disenfranchised resulting from it, the poorly informed people that think that Guild Wars 2 is a cesspit in terms of its gem store now that's full of pay-to-win, hideous stuff? What about all these casual bandwagoners that are now looking to our community? Those bad vibes don't just go away, and you have to acknowledge the existence of a long-term Pyrrhic victory on our hands. That would be my main worry. And I'm open to being wrong on this, by the way. Maybe my mentality is toxic, and it's the wrong one to have. But this is why I'm not screaming at ArenaNet right now, and presuming to know better about how they run their business. I mostly believe that we have one true recourse to affect the gem store, and it's not ranting and raving online. It's voting with our wallet. Not talk about voting with our wallets, but simply doing it. The analysis, the people who are making these decisions about the gem store, they're looking at your stats, not at your comments. And in that respect, I think your comments should be more directed to other people. When you see someone running a skin from the gem store that you don't agree with that practice, you should be talking to those people where it will do much more good than signaling it towards NCSoft, who probably aren't listening, or, heavens forbid, the developers that had no say on this in the first place. And importantly too, voting with your wallet doesn't just mean not spending on things you dislike. It means actively spending on things you do find consumer friendly so that the devs don't feel they have to resort to this kind of stuff. And that's just as much a signal as anything else. Where there is profit is possibly even a bigger signal for how they should act on the gem store than where there's a lack of profit. So that's where I am on this. That's how I genuinely feel. Perhaps I'm overly cynical, but that's the place I'm in. And so I don't really feel like getting on this bandwagon. It's not to save my own skin or to preserve some kind of good relations with the dev or whatever else you might think. It's because I don't actually know how worth it is, and especially at the cost for how we are perceived on the outside, I think is something you have to look at very, very carefully. So that's enough of that. I also want to explain why I don't really feel very angry about the actual update in the first place. And why I personally don't feel angry about the actual update in the first place. And I don't use the word personally there as a filler. I mean it to signify these are personal reasons you probably won't resonate with, but it will get you into my mindset a bit here. First, I've always hated the gem store, okay? Too many people, I think, see this mount adoption thing as a new step down a ladder into the pits of microtransaction crappery, but I can think off the top of my head a ton more things I loathe about the gem store that have been put in over the years that are much worse. And so I'd much quicker talk about these things than this recent development. So the pay-to-winny aspects, right? Strength, protection boosters, stuff like that from vanilla. Watchwork pickaxes, giving you extra currency where other people wouldn't have it. They did the same thing with the magic ones later, which I actually caved in and bought during Season 3. And even like bank and inventory slot sales. I think that Guild Wars 2 2 is extremely aggressive about bag slots and the fact that the bag slots are only character bound and how little you actually start with. These things top my list. Specifically, I mean, this is probably some heavy Guild Wars 1 influence and philosophy leanings in me for this, but these are the worst that the gem store gets. Particularly the top of that list, the strength, protection, regen boosters and stuff. Those were really gross. If you guys don't know the story with these, they were dropped in right at the launch of vanilla Guild Wars 2, amidst everything else with the game. They flew in the face of all pre-release press and statements, which repeatedly assured us that the gem store would only ever be cosmetic stuff. And then right there, they had the audacity at launch to put these in. And there was no backlash about it. People didn't really talk about it, but I believe that's mostly just because in vanilla, there was the enormous distraction of the fact the entire MMO had just released and, you know, it was able to slip in. These days, people don't really care about those and they've been disabled in places that matter, like you can't use them in raids, for example, but not back then. They were available everywhere. And if it weren't for the fact that ArenaNet also at the same time accidentally botched implementing challenging dungeon or group content, these items could have been extremely toxic for the community and extremely gross cash cows. And that never happened, but it was accidental that never happened. And I've always thought that that was one of the grossest things that they've done with the gem store. It was right there at the start. Also, remembering this makes me curious. If this mount adoption system had landed directly with Path of Fire, I wonder whether anyone would have said a single word or this backlash would have existed, and I genuinely think it probably wouldn't have. For the same reason nothing happened in vanilla. People would have been distracted by the content itself and not felt any need to get on a high horse about it. There's also several other toxic things on the gem store that I consider worse than this, especially from like the preying on gamblers perspective and the RNG perspective. We've got home nodes, you've got the permanent contracts of various types, any high value item that's ever come out of a Black Lion chest, gambling on dies as well. All of these are gross to me. Now, these are all trading postable, which is fundamentally different to the mounts. If you're really going to break down this new mount thing, a big difference is you can't TP them. With these, you can trading post them, so any player can potentially get a home node or a permanent contract or whatever with no RNG. And some people have said as a solution to this whole fiasco that all they need to do is make these mount skins trading postable, and there you go. That's the egregious error. That's the big difference. But even considering the trading post with these items like the home nodes and stuff, I still think that the RNG aspect to them is just as dangerous as this mount adoption system has been. People will still gamble on them, seeking to get those jackpots to sell them, or fool themselves into thinking that they can bypass a large upfront cost by buying a ton of Black Lion chests. It has existed in Guild Wars 2 for a long time. I've disliked it in Guild Wars 2 for a long time and come to terms with it a long time ago. There's more as well. So these discussions from the mounts that we had earlier about the dilution of the artistic integrity and the visual space of the game. Yes, there's that. But generally speaking, I loathe any pretty skin or weapon or outfit or cosmetic like minis at all on the gem store. I think all of these have had a big detrimental effect on how much I enjoy Guild Wars 2. Outfits are kind of the big one here. Most people hate outfits because they want armors instead, or because they think that they should be delivered in-game instead, which are valid. But to me, the simple fact that most of the time when I see a good-looking player in Guild Wars 2 these days, it's because they're in an outfit that has no interesting acquisition process, and possibly I can't even buy anymore. That really alters my perspective on the game. When I think back to Guild Wars 1 or other RPGs and seeing someone look cool, there was a kind of magic to it that Guild Wars 2 can never grab. And it was a kind of magic because there was always some adventure you knew you could go on to get the same thing. On the topic of minis, right? Like, minis were so much cooler in a game where they all stood for birthday presents. And when you opened that birthday present at the end of the year, and that was fun RNG there. They're a little bit more boring in Guild Wars 1 once you could start getting them from quests, but they were still pretty cool. In Guild Wars 2, minis, they feel utterly meaningless, and I blame the gem store. The other thing I think sucks, and I've talked about it in this video already, and I mean truly sucks, is the idea of gems to gold at all. The feeling of reward I get for any skin or accomplishment in Guild Wars 2 is significantly lower than anything I feel in any other RPG where that kind of bypass, a gem to gold bypass, doesn't exist. Pretty much the only things I ever care about in Guild Wars 2 these days are now account-bound items, but the worth of even these are dragged down psychologically when the walls have broken away everywhere else, and it's abundantly clear how arbitrary the idea of collecting things is. There's something that happens on a fundamental level about earning rewards in a game like Guild Wars 2, where you know you could just throw money at it, right? Like farming feels like a chore and more pointless, because I know how easily I could bypass that. I remember my excitement in the original game at finding new and efficient farms for the Domain of Anguish, because I realized how fast I could rake in arm braces of truth, and that was dizzying levels of excitement. Nothing good in Guild Wars 2 has ever come close, because on the second day of me playing it, I whacked out my debit card, and I bought gems and realized that getting gold was kind of an arbitrary process. So what's my point with all of this? My point is that the gem store is, and always has been, at its very core, a cesspit. It's good compared to other games, broadly speaking, as I mentioned earlier, but it is by its nature a compromise against your fun and the game maker's profit. That is what it is. I have never once, not for 7 years, looked at the gem store and come away with particularly positive feelings. There is a reason why I nearly always gloss over it in my patch review videos or dedicate videos to it, despite the easy viewership that comes from that. So another thing gets stacked onto the gem store that I don't like, and I think it sucks, which I do, this mount adoption. It's not the worst thing that I think they've done on the gem store, but my expectations were low anyway. So do I feel outraged? No. Do I fear the next step down the ladder? Do I fear the slippery slope? Not really, because I'm probably too far gone for that. Basically, what I'm admitting here, and again, these are personal reasons, is that I'm 7 years deep in acclamation to the existence of a gem store, or 5 years, sorry. Perhaps something for me to take shame in, maybe I should still be fighting, but it's true. And so crusading about this, I just have no passion to. Moving on, a final personal reason I don't really feel angry about this update is a very simple one, and it doesn't need much explanation, and that's that I just don't care much about Fashion Wars 2. You guys know this about me. I'm sure I'd be angrier if I genuinely wanted to buy one of the mount skins, and I could more easily put myself in the position of the many people who don't feel valued as customers. But I don't, because to me, it's just a mount skin. Maybe I'll pick some of these up slowly over time, but I'm in no rush. On that last note, there is a lot of discussion going on with that, relating to the fact these are cosmetic only, so we shouldn't backlash. The argument being in ArenaNet's favor, that it's cosmetic, it doesn't affect you if other people buy it. If you don't find it valuable, if you don't want to gamble, fine, end of story, shut up about it. The world isn't ending. And the rebuttal to this argument being that Guild Wars 2 is all about cosmetic stuff, so it's not okay. I actually don't think either of these stances are any good at all and are best skin deep. Yes, Guild Wars 2 does have a lot of cosmetic progression, but it does have many other forms of progression too. There are collections, legendaries, masteries, achievements, elite specializations, raid progression, fractals, to a lesser extent, PvP leagues. There's all kinds of account-based progression and features to aim for that have nothing to do with how pretty your character looks. You might not care about all of those systems, or even the majority of them. You might actually blitz through some of them in mere days, but they are there. And the more casual the player is, the often more prominently a feature like the mastery system, say, will affect them. The suggestion that it's just cosmetics in Guild Wars 2 that are the be-all and end-all, and that's why this is the worst thing in the world, is farcical. It is idiocy. If you think that the Gemstone mount adoption is extra bad based on this, you should be embarrassed for suggesting it. Fashion Wars 2 is a known joke, and there is truth to Fashion Wars 2, but it is not the reality. Don't take it into any kind of serious discussion. More to the point, even if it was true, that ship has long since sailed. Skins locked behind RNG, skins that have been added and then removed, skins that cost far more gems than most people would say reasonable. These things are not news, just because it's mounts now. We've had the discussions about the Hydra staff and the unique gliders and all of that stuff since long ago. It's the status quo in that sense, not a special case, and I don't feel enthusiasm for raving about it. As for the other side of the coin, I don't think it's particularly descriptive either to say, oh, it's just cosmetic, you can ignore it. Yes, selling cosmetics is preferable to selling like level boosters and health boosters and buffs and whatnot, because you're not going to feel required to make those purchases just to keep up with your friends or to be meta and so on. But selling cosmetics does suck in its own way. It undermines in-game reward systems, among a plethora of other things that we already discussed today. So if that's the crux of your discussion, I think it's pretty weak on both sides. So, that's pretty much most of what I wanted to say. I will round the video out by talking about a solution. Now, at the start of the video, I said that I think everything important on the topic was probably covered in the first hour, and I really mean that. I think the solution was pretty evident pretty quickly, and it doesn't take long to go on about. ArenaNet should allow people to buy these skins individually, just like people ask for Halloween, all right? And the RNG tickets, those should be cheaper, but they should still exist, and the reason they're cheaper is because you're doing a gamble. That's it. Beyond that, they can continue adding new skins and hopefully get a lot of profit out of it and have the game in a really solid green. I don't know. It would be really funny to think that they implemented all of this just because they didn't want to go through the effort of adding a new item to the gem store every time. They just wanted the one thing that would unlock them constantly. That would be such an arbitrary reason for this entire backlash and all this egg to be on their face. I will say also probably that because of that forum thread, despite my cynicism as to the worthwhile and the costs of enacting in this kind of behavior, I think probably they will revert what's going on here. They probably will avoid repeating this format in the future. But I don't think that bad press is going to drop off. I think if people are still upset about the fact that Season 1 was just fixing signs, okay, I think it will take some time for this stain to wash off too. And there you have it, guys. That's my video on the topic. Hopefully you feel a bit more informed about it. Those are my opinions and how I feel. I've been as honest as I can. I hope you're not too offended by me saying I think that people are overreacted. And yeah, just to recap, I do think it sucks. I'm happy we're trying to enact change. I think this is out of proportion. We need to be cautious of a Pyrrhic victory. I think people should vote with their wallets more than anything else, and discussion should be oriented about getting your friends to vote with their wallets as well. I believe that if voting with our wallet doesn't help the situation, then, well, I have no easy solution, and I wonder if that's just where video gaming is going. Maybe we can do a 2-hour production on that at some point in the future. And I do wonder about the future of the game, and I think that this is an important moment. So thanks very much for listening, guys. If you got to the end, you have my absolute respect. You're an absolute boss. I will see you in the comments. As always, I'm curious to hear what you think. And I hope you agree that honesty was the best policy here. I could have just copped out and been angry, rah, 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 and I wouldn't have the kind of accusations I can tell are coming up that I'm an apologist for ArenaNet, blah, blah, blah. But I think this was important to just tell you the truth. So there you go. That's how I feel. Let's hope that lump in my chest wasn't necessary at the start of the video. And I guess we'll be back to normal videos for me tomorrow. I'll keep you posted on how this thing develops, and I'll see you guys very shortly. Cheers all.